So this week we're coming to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's interesting because as the Sermon on the Mount ends, it kind of takes an interesting turn. Now you might remember last week we talked a little bit about how in the sermon Jesus talks so much about trust in that central part of it. After he talks about prayer, he talks about trust, and he talks about not worrying and really just trusting God. Well, here's what's interesting. After he talks about trusting God and not worrying, he gets to another place where he talks a little more seriously, perhaps, a little more in your face, and he is basically sounds like he's like waving the warning flag. So listen to this part of it. And remember, this is coming after this idea of talking about how we're not to worry. A little bit later then in the sermon, he says this in chapter 7, starting at verse 15. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears fruit, but bad trees bear bad fruits. And good trees cannot bear bad fruit, nor can bad trees bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and is thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits. And then he goes on, he says this, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power in your name? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, evildoers. You see what I mean about the warning thing? I mean, if you're going to end a sermon, that's a pretty tough way to end the sermon. But essentially what Jesus is trying to do towards the end of this is he's trying to give them an important warning. Basically, he's trying to say, look, as we try to live in such a way where the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth are going to intersect, we're going to find problems. Because we're going to find wolves in sheep's clothing. We're going to find people who are not bearing the kind of fruit that will help us along the way. And that as we go out there, as we find this crossroad of stepping from in here to out there, we're going to have challenges. Now, here's what's interesting about warnings. When we hear of a warning, the funny thing about warnings sometimes is we kind of hear them not as warnings that are trying to be helpful, but we hear them almost as threats, right? So if you're driving along and you see, slow, children ahead, slow down, or something like that, it's not a threat. It's a warning. There are children playing there. You have to be careful of what's coming next. If we see a sign on the side of the road that says falling rock, it's not a threat that there's someone up there who's going to stand and throw rocks at you as you drive by, right? No, it's a warning that says, hey, this area can be dangerous and there can be rocks that are going to fall down. And if that rock falls down, it's going to hurt you. So beware. You see, Jesus' warnings are not threats. What he's trying to say to us is keep your eyes open, because as we try to live in the kingdom of God, as we try to experience the fullness of God, we're going out there in a world that's not always going to recognize that. And it's going to be difficult sometimes, and it's going to be hard. So yes, lean on your friends, live by those things, those commands that Jesus puts in front of us, but most importantly, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open to what's going on around you, and live within that warning that Jesus gives you, not in the threat, but in the warning. Here's how N.T. Wright talks about this section. I love this. He says, Jesus spoke into a power keg of unrest, division, and simmering violence. People all around were waiting for something big to happen. They expected the change to come in some form of violent revolutionary overthrow, inevitably resulting in a return to the ways of greed, bullying, and power, just within a different group at the helm. I mean, what N.T. Wright's saying there is, as Jesus spoke to these folks, they really thought that the way we're going to turn this world around is by a different form of violence and greed and pressure and all of that. And what Jesus was basically saying is, no, the kingdom of God has nothing to do with that. You're talking about the kingdoms of this world. The revolution that Jesus was trying to bring, and he speaks of on this Sermon on the Mount, is a revolution in which we love our enemies as we love our friends, as we recognize that we need to be caring for those who sometimes harm us, as we bring in God's peace into situations that peace is not what folks are looking for, but someone bigger and badder to beat up the others. Jesus is trying to say this revolution that I am beginning, this revolution that God is beginning through me and through this message, is good news. It's good news of love and grace, and that's what's going to turn the world around. And so he gives us warnings because he knows it's not going to be easy. And at the end of that, he tells a little parable. And the parable goes something like this. There were two people. There was one person who was wise and one person who was foolish. The person who was wise built his house on a firm foundation of rock. And when the troubles came, when the situations were difficult around them, that person's house was able to stand because it was built solidly on a rock. The other person, on the other hand, built on the same thing that we've been trying to build on forever, things like violence and vengeance and greed. And Jesus said that's like a slippery slope. It's like that man who builds on sand, and when those same floods and trouble happen, that house is blown away because it wasn't built on the new solid rock in which Jesus is trying to preach, but it was built on the same old, same old. And Jesus says, anyone who has ears, anyone who hears these words and does what I'm challenging you to do, is like that wise man, building on the rock, and not the foolish one who is building on same old sand. That's the challenge for us. And you know what? Here's the thing, it's not easy. And perhaps that's why Jesus ends this all with warnings. We're at a crossroads. We choose. Which way do we want to go? Jesus' challenge to us is, if we have ears, if we believe that he has the words of life, then build on those words. It's a challenge, but it's a good challenge.